I had a very creepy experience a couple of years ago. I'm an avid reader and have completed many book series. Since I was a kid, reading has been one of my favorite hobbies. I go to my local library all the time to get more books, and there's one very close to where I live. When I went there one time, I was trying to find some new books to read. I was interested in branching out of the types of books that I was used to reading, so this time I spent a lot more time than usual when I was there. I remember that things started out average and then quieted down. It was probably 6 p.m. and the library closed at 7. I was near a random bookshelf in a very quiet area. As I stood in the aisle all by myself, I found some books that I was interested in. I picked one up and wanted to read a little bit to get a feel for the story. I was reading it for maybe 5 minutes or so. Everybody knows how libraries are extremely quiet. This one was especially quiet because it was getting late. I was just reading when all of a sudden I heard what sounded like a whisper coming from behind me. Somebody was saying, "Hey," to me. I turned around but saw no one. It must have been coming from the next aisle over. Maybe they weren't talking to me, whoever it was. I went back to the book. About a minute went by, and then I heard it again. This time it was a little bit louder. It sounded like a man's voice saying, "Hey," and "Hey you" to me. I turned around again, and this time thought that I saw someone moving in the other aisle. I couldn't see much because of all the books on the shelves, and the only thing that I did see was between the empty gaps. I decided to go over there and see what was up. When I walked past to the other side, no one was there. They must have moved out of the way to another aisle. I walked past to a few more aisles. A man was in one of them, and it could have possibly been him, but he wasn't looking in my direction, and I didn't want to ask him. I turned and walked back to where I had been before. I decided to leave because whoever was whispering was kind of creeping me out a little bit. I got the books that I wanted to check out and then did so and left. After I left, I drove home and arrived back just minutes later. But not long after getting inside my apartment, my cell phone started to ring. I did not recognize the number. I picked it up and answered, wondering who it could possibly be. What I heard on the other end was the same whispering that I had heard at the library. Somebody was saying "hey" to me, just like before. It was the same man's voice, it seemed. I asked multiple times who this was. I asked them how they got my number and why they were calling me as well. None of my questions were answered, though. After maybe 10 seconds of whispering, followed by about 10 seconds or so of silence, the person on the other end hung up. I then blocked the number. After that, I didn't go back to that particular library for several months. I only went back there during that time to return books. Luckily, I never got another strange call or had another encounter like that. I've been back to that library since, and everything's fine. I still wonder, though, who that was and how they got my number. I used to work at a library not too far from where I lived. We were open from 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. from Monday to Thursday. The rest of the week we closed earlier at 5 p.m. I mostly just worked on weekdays, though, and oftentimes in the evening. One night I was working a Thursday until close. Things would usually be very quiet for the last several hours. During that time, we would only have one employee working, which was me. The library was a little bit on the smaller side. It was just one level, and had just about everything you would want in a library still, though. So on this night, it was very quiet, like usual. I was by myself starting at 5 p.m. for the final 3 hours. During the 5 o'clock hour, a few people were there, but by 6 it was completely empty other than me. At least, that's what I thought. There was only one entrance and exit to the library, so it would be easy to tell when people came and went. I was sitting behind my desk where you could check out books. From where I was, I could see a large area of the library, but not all of it. It was now dark outside and completely silent, which was always a little bit strange. At probably like 6.30, as I was just sitting there, I heard a noise of what sounded like somebody walking through an aisle. There were obviously lots of bookshelves, and I couldn't see into most of the aisles. Then, just for a second, I saw a man appear, walking from behind one bookshelf and go behind another one. He was tall and thin, wearing all black clothing. But the most notable thing was that he was wearing an alien mask. It was green and really creepy looking. I hadn't seen him before, so he must have put on his mask when he was already inside or something. I wasn't really quite sure what he was doing. Maybe some kind of a prank. Nobody else seemed to be here, though. After he went behind another bookshelf, everything was silent again. He had been sort of far away from me because there was a little lounge area between where I was and the bookshelves. About 10 minutes went by. Then, just for a second, I saw him again. This time he came out of an aisle a ways away from where he was before. It was sort of creepy seeing him. I thought about saying something but didn't. For the next hour, probably, I didn't see or hear him at all. I was starting to worry because we would be closing shortly, and I didn't want to have to kick this guy out. When we would be closing in 30 minutes, I made the announcement over the library speakers. He didn't leave immediately after, though. All I heard was silence. Then just about 5 minutes after that, I saw through a bookshelf, the man appearing to stare at me. It was really far away, and he was sticking his head between some books, making it visible to me. I smiled, thinking that it was a joke when I saw it. He didn't move, though. Soon it became uncomfortable, and I looked away. Maybe a minute later, I looked back, and he was still there. This was really weird, and I looked away again. I focused on my computer screen for the next several minutes. The next time that I looked, he was gone. Soon, I gave the 15-minute warning that we would be closing. The guy in the alien mask was the only person in the entire library besides me. I didn't see him for the rest of the time until we closed. I gave multiple more warnings on the speakers. It was now 8 o'clock and just me and him were inside. I really had no idea as to where he was. I scanned my eyes around everything that I could see but did not see him. I hadn't heard anything either, and it was so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. So I decided that I needed to go and find this guy and tell him that we were now closed. I got up, and I will admit was sort of nervous. I started at the front and made my way towards the back, going through every single aisle. Not long after starting, I heard a noise coming from the back. I started walking in the direction that I heard it, but couldn't seem to find the guy. I called out asking if anybody was there and saying that we were now closed, but I got nothing in response. As I looked from one shelf to another, I soon found myself towards the back of the library. I really had no idea where this guy could have gone. Then I heard a book fall from a shelf closer to the front. It was a ways away. I walked over there, but never saw the man. I picked up the book and then walked up and down every single aisle of the library again, covering every inch of the place. I even looked in the bathrooms and areas that were off limits to the public. I couldn't find him anywhere. I didn't hear any more noises either. He must have left. The man was really good at avoiding me. After staying long past what I planned to, I finally left for the night. I really don't know what that man was doing, but he really creeped me out. He literally stayed in the library for at least 3 hours. That was my scariest experience working there. Back when I was a kid, I used to go to the library all the time. This was in the early 2000s when smartphones weren't around. I got a lot of entertainment looking at books. I was probably like 6 or 7 years old at the time that this occurred. I was decent at reading, but I much preferred to just look at the pictures. When we went to the library, it would usually be my mom, my sister, and me. We would go down to the public library that was only about a mile from our house. Each week, we would go and check out new books and VHS tapes and then bring them back home. I would be really excited to go, and it was one of the main forms of entertainment for me. One time, I went on a weekday afternoon with my mom and sister as usual. I went to my usual spot of the children's section. There were quite a few bookshelves in the children's area. There were also some tables and chairs and stuff. It was somewhat separated from the rest of the library. My sister is a few years older than me, and sometimes she would go to the other parts of the library to get books. My mom would usually be with my sister, and I would go off and find the books that I wanted to get. My mom would find me when it was time to go, or to let me know that she was going to another part of the library. This time, after arriving, I went to one of the aisles with a lot of picture books. The library was relatively quiet from what I can remember. I know that I sat down on the floor in one of the aisles between bookshelves and started looking at books. There were some interesting ones with lots of pictures in them. I got carried away and some time went by. I'm not sure exactly how long, but maybe an hour or so. Then I remember out of nowhere, a man entered the aisle. I moved to the side to get out of the way, but I remained sitting on the floor and reading a book. The man walked over to me, though, and then stopped. I looked up at him wondering what he wanted. He asked me what my name was, and I told him. He then told me that my mom was looking for me. I believed him, and I put the book that I was reading back on the shelf and then stood up. The man told me that my mom asked him to help look for me. I wasn't sure if this guy worked at the library or not. The librarians typically just wore normal clothes, but I didn't recognize the man. It was possible that he did, and also maybe did not. He told me to follow him, though, so I did. We walked out of the aisle and then around the corner. There we were in a more open area. I followed him through that area and he was walking kind of fast. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw my mom. She was to my right and kind of far away. The man was not walking in her direction at all. He was also going towards the front of the library. I stopped and started walking over to my mom. I thought that maybe the man had mistaken me for another kid, or possibly he thought my mom was someone else. Either way, I knew where my mom was. When I started walking to her at first, the guy turned around and I saw him start to walk closer to me. Then he suddenly stopped and turned back. He kept going where he originally had been. I made it back over to my mom, who was in the corner of the children's section with my sister. I looked back over and the man was now gone. I think he left the entire library. I really didn't think all that much of the experience. For the rest of the time that I was there that day, though, I stuck with my mom and sister. Years later, looking back, I think that he would have actually left the library with me. I'm really glad that I located my mom when I did. I'm a 22-year-old female living in a city, but I grew up in a small town on the west coast of Newfoundland, Canada. It was a small, relatively safe town. Not a whole lot ever really happened there. Some drug busts and a couple of suicides several years ago. Anyway, between the ages of 16 and 19, I volunteered and then worked at my town's public library. My coworkers were all wonderful, and the patrons generally liked me as I was always very polite and cheerful. But there was one guy. I remember seeing this guy around town from the time I was really young, and we always called him the turtle guy because he had this sort of pigeon-like walk, sauntering around and bobbing his head a lot. Seemed harmless at first, but still a little off. We had a CAP intern working with us for a while at the library. She would teach computer classes to some of the patrons on occasion. She was petite and quite pretty. Turtle Guy, as we'll call him, would get classes with her every chance he got. I worked almost every day, and he was at the library every day. He would bring her candy bars sometimes, and always asked way too personal questions. After a while, the girl's internship ended, and she stopped giving computer classes. This is when Turtle Guy seemed to turn his attention to me. I'm short for my age, always have been. I stand at about 5 feet in sneakers. I'm also petite, and I've always looked young. At 19, people would mistake me for 14, no joke. Anyway, so I'd be tidying the shelves some days, and this guy would just come up to me and start chatting with me. Harmless, really. Asking my first and last name, although I never told him my last name, but he knew my first as I worked there. He'd also ask things like if I was in school. I was in college at the time, so I truthfully said yes. He'd ask what I was studying, how old I was. Thankfully, he never asked where I lived. I always walked around town on my days off when I was bored, and I remember one day he mentioned to me that I always looked kind of sad when I walked places, and that I didn't look confident in myself. That kind of creeped me out a bit. The worst, I think, though, was when I volunteered to paint little pictures and sayings on the walls in the kids' section of the library, and also a welcome sign banner thing over the front door and the porch. While I was painting in the kids' section, I'd listen to my iPod and really get in the zone while working. Turtle Guy would almost every day come up behind me and watch me paint. One day I could hear him breathing heavily over the sound of my music, very creepy and kind of disturbing. He would talk to me on occasion while I was painting in that part of the library, but mostly just watch me as I would ignore him. I always felt him there, watching. The worst was when I was painting the banner that had the wooden letters for the welcome sign that would be glued to the wall in the porch. I had to block the main doors and people would have to go through the side door to get into the library itself. I would be standing on a ladder painting away as people would come and go. I, of course, was always listening to music. Turtle Guy would, as per usual, stop and watch me paint for a while before entering and leaving the library. One day, according to one of my co-workers, Jay, Turtle Guy decided to almost try something. While I was standing on the ladder and Jay was watching Turtle Guy watch me, the guy decided to raise his hand up towards me as if he were going to grab my rear end. I had no clue as to what was going on because I was concentrating on the task at hand with music playing. But Jay told me that afterward, and it freaked me out. I now hate having people behind me at any time. Not really creepy, but also related. Whenever my then boyfriend would come to pick me up from work, if Turtle Guy was there, he'd give him a really hate-filled look. I never noticed this, but my boyfriend told me about it a few times. Also related, this guy used to be attached to another librarian. She'd read to him, but when she stopped, he got aggressive and even slapped her at the library. He was banned but was allowed back in as long as he took his meds. Yes, he was on medication from what I was told.